The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. I'm Wes, and sitting across from me is my wife and co-host Beth.
Hello, everyone.
Before we get started tonight, we want to give a huge shout out to Mr. Jim Harold, host of the Paranormal Podcast and Jim Harold's Campfire. Jim is one of the original podcasters of the paranormal, and last Thursday, Beth was able to share a ghostly experience that we had while we were staying in Gettysburg. We covered it on our show way back in episode 4, I believe, but we thought his listeners might like the story of what happened to us, so we got a hold of Jim and he put our story on, and it includes some of the EVPs that we caught while we were staying there.
Yes, and let me just say that Jim is the nicest guy. When you tape a story with him, he's just as kind and personable off air as he is on air, and he has been incredibly kind to us. So if you're new to us because you heard my story last week on the campfire, thank you for joining us. And thank you, Jim, for having me on.
Yes, thank you again, Jim. We really appreciate you. Okay, so for our weekly housekeeping, we'd like to remind everyone to check out our merch on the TeePublic store.
We have several cool designs that you can get on all kinds of products, from clothing to coffee mugs to stickers to anything you can imagine.
Yeah, there's all kinds of crap on there that you might need or you might not, but it's got our logo on it.
With cool designs.
That's right. And also, if you haven't checked out our premium bonus episodes yet, go ahead, give one a try. You've got nothing to lose but $3.
There's a bunch of them on all different topics just waiting for you to check them out. And like Wes said, they're only $3 an episode, and the money you spend goes directly back into our production costs each month. And lastly, if you haven't joined our Where Our Minds Wander Facebook page, you might want to do that. We post pictures and updates, and it's a great place to find like-minded people. Or you can follow us on Twitter or TikTok.
That you can. We're pretty much everywhere these days, aren't we?
Feels like it.
I know, it's like a full-time job. So we have a couple of great stories tonight for everyone.
We do. So why don't you go first tonight?
The 4-story, unassuming white building has quite a few stories to tell. A duel that ended in murder. Hundreds of deaths from yellow fever. Famous visitors like James Audubon, dozens of reported paranormal encounters, and a great place to grab a beer. But be wary, because as you're sipping your drink and dining on pub food, you may feel your cheeky date grab your leg under the table, even though both of her hands are clearly visible. And ladies, if you need to use the restroom, be prepared to spend a little extra time in there when the stall door refuses to open, no matter how hard you push. And if you're playing billiards in the basement, well, you just might hear voices in your ear when no one is there, or even have your arm jostled by an unseen force. In case you're wondering, tonight I'm talking about the Moon River Brewing Company in Savannah, Georgia. The building at 21 Bay Street wasn't always a pub and brewery. It was originally the first hotel in Savannah when it was built by Eliezer Early in 1821. His wealthy wife had purchased the plot of land in 1817. The city hotel had 33 rooms, not including the bar. Mr. Early rented out portion of the hotel to the United States Post Office. He also had a career in banking. So he opened up the first branch of the Second Bank of the United States inside its walls. You could take out cash, mail a letter, and rent a room all in the same building. Mr. Early also housed 8 enslaved individuals at this time. 5 of them who were younger than 14, which may explain the shadow figure both employees and patrons have encountered in the basement. They call him Toby. Toby apparently lurks in the shadows, appearing as a shadow himself. While playing pool, patrons have reported feeling as if someone has shoved them, even though no one is close enough to have done so. Others report suddenly feeling incredibly cold for no reason. Is Toby the ghost of an enslaved man? No one knows for sure, but his shadow has been seen the most out of all the ghostly residents at the brewery. There were also some very notable people who stayed at the City Hotel in its heyday. The Marquis de Lafayette, also Winfield Scott, who was a war hero of 1812, and as I mentioned earlier, James Audubon. Audubon actually stayed there for 6 months, trying to sell his books. Winfield Scott was a career military man, and he was the Whig Party nominee for president. He lost to Franklin Pierce. In 1820, and then again in 1854, Savannah suffered a yellow fever outbreak. In the case of the 1854 outbreak, the City Hotel was the only public building in the city that remained open. However, the 2 top floors were allegedly used as a hospital for victims of yellow fever. To this day, visitors who go up to the top 2 floors describe the air as heavy and oppressive. However, employees who venture up to the top 2 floors of the building often hear the sound of children. They might hear what sounds like children laughing or playing. They might even experience the eerie sensation of children running towards them or away from them. Or, if they're on the 3rd floor, they hear them running back and forth over their heads. It's possible that these children died of yellow fever. There doesn't seem to be any other explanation for why their spirits are still there. In 1826, John Miller became the City Hotel's manager, and when he died a year later, his wife took over the job. I couldn't find her name, but she may be a contender for the identity of the woman in white, who's often seen on the 3rd floor. The apparition of the woman is so frequent that employees refer to her as Miss Johnson, but I wasn't able to find any woman by that name who was connected to the hotel. But one of the most well-documented tragedies to take place at the City Hotel happened in August of 1832. Prominent citizens James Stark, a legislator, and Philip Minnis, a Jewish army surgeon, finally came face to face. Although it's not really clear how the animosity between the 2 men actually started, it may have been because Stark used an ethnic slur against Minnis when the 2 were at a horse track. Other witnesses said that it began at Ludington's bar when Stark called Minnis an ethnic slur and then said that Minnis wasn't, quote, worth the powder and lead it would take to kill him. A third witness said it all started when Stark felt that Minnis cheated at a game of horseshoes. Regardless, they didn't like each other very much, and Minnis demanded Stark apologize for saying the things that he had said. Apparently, Stark did apologize, but then later on ran his mouth off to his friends that he didn't mean it. Then, as men apparently did back in the 1830s, they had their friends write letters to each other on their behalf. Minnis wanted an apology, and Stark refused. The letter writing ended when Stark announced that he'd arranged a duel. Minnis replied that he wasn't able to meet that day, but Stark purposely showed up anyways, and then spread rumors that Minnis was a coward. On August 10th, Minnis strode into the City Hotel. He'd heard that Stark was there, and he planned to confront him. Before Stark could draw his gun, Minnis proclaimed him a coward and shot him in the chest, killing him instantly. Minnis was acquitted of murder. The sentiment seemed to be that Savannah was in too great of a need for a doctor, and therefore Minnis was let go. Does James Stark still haunt the Moon River Brewing Company? Many people who have experienced strange things on the main floor would say he does. Patrons and employees have experienced liquor bottles being thrown at them by something unseen. They've reported feeling grabbed, pinched, and shoved when there was no one around them who could have done so. Stark's restless spirit is said to be the one who grabs women's knees underneath the table while they eat, or brushes against their shoulders, or touches their hair. Several women have gone into the restroom and found that the stall door absolutely won't budge when they try to open it, as if someone very strong is holding it shut. After several minutes of frustration and panicking trying to get the door to budge, the stall door will just swing open as if someone on the other side has released their hold on it. The City Hotel passed through many hands over the decades with a string of various owners and managers. Now, not that this has any relevance to it being haunted, but I thought this was way too cool not to mention. One of the owners had a real-life pair of lions at the hotel to try to draw in guests.
Wow. I guess they didn't worry about liability back then.
No, but I can see where people want to go there and see some lions.
Absolutely.
But luckily, there aren't any lions haunting the place.
That's a good thing.
After the City Hotel closed its doors, the building was used as a lumber warehouse, a coal warehouse, and an office supply store. In 1999, it became the Moon River Brewing Company. It was during renovations that contractors allegedly walked off the job because of unexplained creepy things that they felt or experienced, like the feeling of being watched and being pushed. And since the Moon River Brewing Company moved in, the encounters with Toby, James Stark, the playing children, and the woman in white have become a common occurrence. Although Moon River doesn't offer ghost tours, there are several private companies who mention the brewery on their tours. So it's basically a well-known haunt for good beer, good food, and actual hauntings.
It sounds like a cool place.
That it does. And if you're without a date, you may have a cheeky ghost, kind of feel up your leg.
Yes, because that's what we all want. When me and my friends are talking about eligible bachelors out there, there's inevitably one of us who goes, well, I'd take a cheeky ghost.
Well, I'm just thinking, you work all the time. You don't have time to date. You want to go to the pub, have a few beers, get some good food, and you're sitting there all alone going, oh, I don't have anybody to share this meal with. And then, lo and behold, little play going on with your knee.
Until they have to go to the bathroom and then they get locked into the stall.
Well, you can't have it all.
Take the good with the bad, people.
Right. Sometimes you got to be a little frightened to have some cheeky pleasure with a ghost.
There's something wrong with you. Hey, did you know? Certain well-known historical facts just aren't true. For example, George Washington's false teeth were not made out of wood. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." And Paul Revere never cried out, "The British are coming." Albert Einstein never failed math in school, and Viking helmets were not topped with horns. But there are also true historical facts you've probably never heard. For example, a town in New Jersey put tomatoes on trial in 1820. Roman Emperor Caligula once made his favorite horse a senator. And Charlie Chaplin once entered a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest and came in at 20th place. Who'd have thunk it?
All right, Beth. Why don't you tell everyone where your mind wandered this week?
There's a game you've been invited to join. It's best done at night, in the dark. Light a few candles, and as the flickering glow casts eerie shadows, you and your friends sit down on the floor, as close as you can get to the low coffee table. As each of you look at each other, one or two of you may giggle nervously as the ringleader, Jennifer, starts to speak. Jennifer's voice is soft but with a spooky edge as she says, "If there are any spirits here, you are invited to speak with us." The whole group takes a collective breath as each of you places one finger on the white plastic object resting at the center of the board. "Oh, wait," Susie interrupts. Shoulders relax as a few of you chuckle. She stands up to remove a silver coin from her pocket. "We forgot this," she explains as she places it on the board. "Okay, we're good." She sits back down and places her finger next to yours. She nods at Jennifer, who takes a deep breath. "Is there anyone here who wishes to speak to us?" Jennifer asks. In the silence that follows her question, everyone's heart begins to collectively race with anticipation. Maybe, within that second or two, one of your more skeptical friends, Joe, mutters, "I told you nothing would happen." But then, something does happen. Barely perceptible at first, the white plastic object, called a planchette, which all of you are barely even touching, begins to move. As it glides over the board covered in letters of the alphabet, you lock eyes with Joe across from you. Unable to contain herself, Jennifer asks again, "Do any spirits wish to speak to us?" Joe isn't looking so sure of himself now. The planchette, seemingly with a mind of its own, continues to slide until it comes to rest on one of the only 3 words written on the board. Yes. Everyone's heartbeat kicks up a notch as Jennifer asks her next question. "What is your name?" Almost immediately, the planchette sweeps across the board, landing on the first letter. As it slides from letter to letter, Jennifer calls them out. E-L-L-E-N. Ellen. That was your grandmother's name. Grandma Ellie died a decade ago, but is she here, communicating with you? Joe rolls his eyes. Before Jennifer can ask her next question, he cuts in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, Ellen, are you a demon?" The planchette crosses the board so quickly that it lands on an answer before you even have a chance to breathe. Your eyes tear up, and full body chills course their way through you as you and everyone else playing the game stare at the word partially hidden under the clear window of the planchette. Yes. "Oh, shit," Jennifer says. Susie, the one member of the group who didn't want to play this game in the first place, shakily cries, "I told you we shouldn't be messing with this." "It's just a game," Joe retorts angrily. "We moved the stupid plastic thingy ourselves. You guys wanted it to move, so you unconsciously made it move." "But what if we didn't?" Jennifer asks. That is the question millions of people have been asking about their Ouija boards for over 200 years. Some of you listening right now may already feel anxious just because I've mentioned the words Ouija board. Some of you may have had experiences of your own, good or bad. Some of you may be rolling your eyes, just like our skeptical friend Joe. No matter how you feel about Ouija boards, they're a silly board game that people make too much out of, or there's something you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, that's okay. Ouija boards have brought out those feelings in people for a very long time, and tonight I'm going to talk about why. More people probably know more about the superstitions surrounding Ouija boards than have actually used them. I mean, consider the number of horror movies where the characters either use one, talk about one, or have one inconspicuously visible in the background. Entire movies have been based on Ouija boards, and the movie industry has always relied on the same set of rules for using them. Never use a board when you're alone. Never lift your finger off of the planchette during a session. Never walk away from a board without properly closing the veil between you and the spirits. Never use a board you found tucked behind a wall in the attic or hidden in a creepy basement. Never let the spirits count down through the numbers or run through the alphabet. Never leave the planchette on the board if you aren't using it. What happens if you do any of these things? Well, according to the superstition, any of those things allows evil spirits to escape. But that's not all. If the planchette moves from one corner to the next, hitting all four corners, or if it moves in a figure 8, an evil spirit is present. If the planchette falls off the board, a spirit will get loose. And worst of all, if you don't dispose of a Ouija board properly, really bad things will happen. So, how do you get rid of one? Well, don't burn it. Apparently, the flimsy cardboard and industrial ink screams if you light it on fire. And if you hear those screams, you have just 36 hours to live. Now, there's a plot to a horror movie. If you want to get rid of the board, first you have to break the board into 7 pieces, then sprinkle all 7 pieces with holy water and then bury them. So, where do these superstitions come from? They're actually older than you might think. But then again, Ouija boards, or talking boards as they were once called, might be older than you think. Although the exact origin of talking boards is unknown, there is evidence that the ancient Chinese used something similar in 551 BC. The ancient Chinese were very much into automatic writing, and they used it in some of their scriptures. They are also mentioned in records from ancient Rome. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, the first advertisements for commercial Ouija boards popped up in newspapers in February of 1891. A Pittsburgh toy and novelty shop promised a, quote, magical device that could answer questions about the past, present, and future with marvelous accuracy. They claimed their talking board would provide, quote, never-failing amusement and recreation for all the classes. Their magical talking board cost $1.50. The year 1891 is important because it was right smack dab in the middle of the spiritualism movement. People wanted to communicate with the dead. I mean, if you think about it, the Civil War had only ended 30 years before. Disease and accidents were ravaging families every day. The average life expectancy was 50, and child mortality rates were extremely high. And the manufacturers of the first commercial talking boards were well aware of this. But they honestly had no interest in communicating with the dead. Their interests were purely monetary. In 1886, Charles Kennard came across an Associated Press article that got his entrepreneurial juices flowing. The article described a new fad. A talking board was all the rage in the spiritualist camps of Ohio. He enlisted the help of a local furniture maker who specialized in coffins to produce the first prototypes. By 1890, he started the Kennard Novelty Company in Baltimore, and he and his 4 investment partners, including an attorney named Elijah Bond, began manufacturing their talking boards. The only problem was that the U.S. Patent Office would not issue a patent unless they could prove that the board actually worked. Enter Helen Kelly, Bond's sister-in-law, a self-proclaimed medium. She went to Washington and placed the talking board on a table in front of the patent officer. He said that if the talking board correctly knew and spelled his first name, he'd be convinced. Helen correctly spelled his first name. Now, I'd mentioned that Bond was an attorney, but I didn't say what kind. It just so happened he was a patent attorney. So, was it really a spirit that supplied the officer's name to Helen? Or was there some money exchanged somewhere along the way so they'd know the man's name ahead of time? Helen was also the one to name their talking board Ouija. She claimed she got the name from spirits on the other side and that the word meant good luck. But there might be a more mundane explanation. At the time, Ouija was the name of a very popular women's rights activist, and Bond's sister-in-law must have admired her because she wore a locket with Ouida's face on it. Perhaps, according to experts, she'd simply changed one letter of the name. But that wouldn't be a very good selling point, so the Kennard Novelty Company said that Helen contacted spirits while using their talking board, and the spirits told her what to call it. On February 10, 1891, the Ouija board had its patent. By 1892, the Ouija board was in such high demand that 200 boards were being sold a week. The Kennard Novelty Company opened 6 more factories in 6 major cities, including Chicago, New York, and London, just to keep up. But a year later, Kennard and Bond were forced out, and a new guy took over, William Fuld. Fuld had worked his way up the ladder, and by 1898, he owned all of the licensing rights. The Ouija board was an incredible moneymaker. It made Fuld a millionaire and caused some major family problems. Apparently, Fuld cut his brother Isaac out of the business, and Isaac was so angry he had his infant daughter exhumed from the family burial plot and moved elsewhere. Their feud lasted for decades. And in 1927, William Fuld died in a freak accident. He was standing up on the roof of one of his factories watching a flagpole be installed when the iron railing he was leaning against came loose. One of his ribs pierced his heart in the fall. But here's the thing. Fuld had claimed in the Baltimore Sun that he had built that specific factory because the Ouija board told him to. Excellent marketing ploy, except detractors were quick to jump on his accident as proof that nothing good could come from a talking board. By the 1920s, feelings about the Ouija board were already dividing people. There were those who saw it as a parlor game and those who viewed it as an instrument of the devil. It didn't help that newspapers tended to focus on the negative. For example, in 1921, the New York Post ran an article about a woman who said she wasn't suffering from mania. She'd left her mother's dead body in her living room for 15 days because her Ouija board told her to. But there were just as many positive outcomes. For example, they also reported in 1941 about a young man who enlisted in the Army because his Ouija board told him to. Various poets and authors have written acclaimed pieces of poetry and fiction that they've claimed came to them while communicating with spirits through a Ouija board. Sylvia Plath is one, and James Merrill. Even Norman Rockwell did a cover for the Saturday Evening Post in 1920 depicting a young fashionable couple using a Ouija board. And how much more American apple pie can you get than Norman Rockwell? Lucy and Ethel even used one in season 1 of I Love Lucy in 1951. Ethel pretended to be a medium, and Lucy voiced one of the spirits, all to impress a producer into hiring Ricky. It was pure comedy, of course. So, for over 7 decades, the Ouija board was seen as mostly a harmless parlor game. Of course, there were those who believed it was evil because it went against their religious beliefs, but it wasn't actually the church that cemented the belief that Ouija boards are incredibly dangerous. It was actually a little movie called The Exorcist in 1973. In it, 12-year-old Regan uses a Ouija board by herself, and pretty much everyone on the planet knows how that turned out. Wanting to cash in on the box office success of The Exorcist, subsequent horror movies began using the Ouija board as a major plot point, but a purely evil one, supplying moviegoers with a litany of rules. Soon, religious groups were boycotting the films and burning Ouija boards in massive bonfires. And these boycotts and burnings haven't stopped, mostly because the reason people started buying Ouija boards changed. The Exorcist was a scary movie, And by default, Ouija boards were a scary thing, and people liked to be scared. They weren't buying them as a silly parlor game anymore. They were buying them to scare themselves. And in some cases, of course, it really does. Recently, 28 girls at a school in Colombia, South America, were hospitalized for anxiety after playing with Ouija boards. Anxiety. That says something, doesn't it? These girls were so anxious, either from going against their family's religious beliefs or from all the superstitions that they'd heard, that they had to be hospitalized. And what if anxiety is half of what's really going on when people play with Ouija boards, and the other half is something called the ideometer effect? The ideometer effect was first proven in 1852 by physician and physiologist William Benjamin Carpenter. Basically, the ideometer effect is when your muscles react without your conscious will. In 1853, Michael Faraday conducted several experiments where he proved that table tipping during seances was actually being done by the participants themselves without them even realizing it. Most websites on the ideometer effect use the example of labeling a paper with yes or no and then holding any sort of pendulum over the paper. As you ask your questions, the pendulum will inevitably swing towards the answer you subconsciously know to be true. If it works with tables and pendulums, why wouldn't it work with Ouija boards? An experiment was conducted in 2015 at the University of British Columbia, where participants were asked simple, factual, yes or no questions. They, of course, had trouble answering the questions they were unsure of and often got those answers wrong. But then, when a Ouija board was placed in front of them and they were asked the exact same questions, they correctly answered several of the questions they'd gotten wrong. The act of moving the planchette, even though they didn't think they were moving it, helped them recall information. The cool thing is that Michael Faraday had already known this was what would happen back in 1853. He said, quote, "The Ouija boards never provided answers that sitters themselves did not know," end quote. So, essentially, when you're sitting around a Ouija board with a bunch of your friends, you are all moving the planchette yourselves. And the answers you are spelling out are simply the most dominant person's answers that they already think they know. If you think it's going to be scary, then it's going to be scary. And if you already have some anxiety about using one, then of course that anxiety is going to increase during and after. And if you think it's just a silly parlor game, then it's just a silly parlor game. I guess it all comes down to what you personally believe. So, we're kind of right back where we started.
Yeah, I have mixed opinions on the Ouija board, but there are a lot of people that truly believe in them, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely not. As always, if you'd like to know more about the topics we covered, you can always go to our show notes to find our sources.
And if you'd like to meet us and you're into Bigfoot, mark September 30th on your calendars. Beth and I will be at the 2023 Whitehall Sasquatch Festival, and we'd love to see you all there.
Yes, we would, and that's Whitehall, New York, and it's on September 30th.
So if you can make it, get there. It's really a great event, and there's so much there.
There's a lot to see and a lot to do, and it's a cool little town, so we highly recommend that everybody come check it out.
All right, Beth, I guess that about wraps it up for this episode.
I believe so.
Join us all again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.